April 8th, 1943. The air is thin and achingly cold, 5 miles above the pastoral landscapes of Normandy, France. In the cockpit of his Focke-Wulf 190A5, Luftwaffe Oberleutnant Ralph Herget surveys his domain. Below him, the world is a patchwork of green fields and slumbering villages, a conquered territory held firmly in the iron grip of the Third Reich. Above, the sun glints off the plexiglass canopy, a crystal-clear dome through which he views the unfolding battle space. Herget is an ace, a veteran of the Jagdgeschwader 26 Schlagetter, one of Germany's most elite fighter wings. He and his comrades are the undisputed masters of these skies. They have faced the best the Royal Air Force has to offer, the elegant but fragile Spitfires, the rugged Hurricanes, and have bested them time and again. They are knights of the modern age, their mounts forged in the fires of German ingenuity, honed by nearly 4 years of relentless combat across Poland, France, Britain, and the vast, frozen steppes of Russia. Today, a new challenger appears. Peering down, Herget's oxygen mask cannot conceal the triumphant smirk spreading across his face. Climbing laboriously, almost painfully from the lower altitudes, are the ungainly silhouettes of new American fighters making their combat debut over occupied Europe. These are the Republic P-47 Thunderbolts of the American 8th Air Force's 4th Fighter Group. To the seasoned German pilots, accustomed to the lithe, predatory lines of their own interceptors and the nimble designs of their enemies, these strange new aircraft are an absurdity. They are colossal, barrel-chested monstrosities with ridiculously broad fuselages, greenhouses for canopies, and wings that seem far too small to possibly lift their immense 7-ton bulk. They look less like birds of prey and more like grounded, wing-clipped farm animals. Herget keys his throat microphone, his voice dripping with derision as he transmits to his wingman. "The Amis haben uns fliegende Milchfläschchen geschickt," he broadcasts, the transmission crackling across the formation. "The Yanks have sent us flying milk bottles." A wave of laughter ripples through the German radio channel. The comparison is perfect. The P-47 shape, particularly with the ventral turbo supercharger ducting, gives it a portly, bottle-like appearance. It seems a joke, a gross miscalculation by American designers who clearly do not understand the lethal calculus of European air combat. Below, 16 of these P-47C models lumber upward, their 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engines straining, groaning against the thin air, fighting gravity with every foot of altitude gained. What Herget and the other wolves of the Luftwaffe, circling patiently high above, cannot possibly know is that they are not witnessing a blunder. They are witnessing a paradigm shift. They're looking at the physical embodiment of a different way of war, a philosophy not of technical finesse, but of overwhelming industrial logic. Within the broad, seemingly inadequate wings of those flying milk bottles, a mathematical equation of destruction is already loaded and waiting. Each aircraft carries 8 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns, and within their ammunition bays are 3,400 rounds of armor-piercing incendiary death. It is a combined rate of fire of over 6,000 rounds per minute per plane, a storm of lead so dense that it can saw a Messerschmitt in half in under 2 seconds. Within 18 months, these objects of derision will become instruments of abject terror. The laughter in the German cockpits will fade, replaced by a cold, primal fear. The sound of those 8 synchronized Brownings will become the most dreaded sound in the skies of the Reich, a mechanical death rattle that signals the systematic annihilation of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm. On this crystal-clear April morning, the wolves are laughing, but the thunder is gathering. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt does not begin in a moment of inspiration, but in a moment of sheer panic. In June of 1940, the world held its breath as the seemingly invincible German war machine swept across France. The French Armée de l'Air was shattered, the British Expeditionary Force was in a desperate retreat from Dunkirk, and the Luftwaffe's Messerschmitt Bf-109s and 110s reigned supreme. In the United States, a chilling realization dawned upon the high command of the Army Air Corps. They had nothing in their arsenal capable of challenging, let alone defeating Germany's best fighters at high altitude. An urgent directive was issued, a cry for a new generation of interceptor that could meet the enemy on equal terms in the thin, cold air above 20,000 feet. The call went out to Republic Aviation in Farmingdale, Long Island. There, the challenge was taken up by their chief designer, a brilliant and notoriously stubborn Georgian-born émigré named Alexander Kartveli. Kartveli was a visionary, an engineer who saw beyond the conventional wisdom of the day. While European design philosophy, including Germany's, was obsessed with creating lightweight, agile interceptors optimized for climb rate and turning performance, Kartveli had a different vision. He understood the dawning reality of modern aerial warfare. It would be a contest not just of pilot skill, but of engine power, firepower, and sheer survivability. He also understood the foundational strength of his adopted homeland, the unparalleled might of its industrial base. Kartveli took the Army's specifications and designed something that wasn't just an evolution, but a revolution. He started not with an airframe, but with an engine, the most powerful aircraft engine then available, the monstrous Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder air-cooled radial powerhouse capable of producing a staggering 2,000 horsepower. Then he added a complex and heavy turbo supercharger system, a device that used the engine's own exhaust gases to spin a turbine, compressing the thin air of high altitude and forcing it into the engine, allowing it to maintain sea-level power in the stratosphere where conventional engines gasped and died. This entire system, with its intricate network of ducts running through the fuselage, is what gave the aircraft its uniquely deep-bellied, almost pregnant appearance. Around this engine and turbocharger, Kartveli designed the airplane. He built it big, he built it heavy, and he built it strong. The structure was massively over-engineered, with wing spars that could withstand forces far beyond what was required. He armed it not with a mix of light machine guns and slow-firing cannon, but with a devastating battery of 8 heavy 50 caliber Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing. He armored the cockpit with thick steel plate and bulletproof glass. He gave the pilot a roomy, comfortable cockpit, a small detail that would prove crucial in reducing fatigue on long, grueling escort missions. He admitted to his design team, "It will be a dinosaur, but it will be a dinosaur with good proportions." When the XP-47B prototype first took to the skies on May 6, 1941, it shocked everyone who laid eyes on it. Empty, it weighed nearly 10,000 pounds, a staggering 65% more than its predecessor, the P-43 Lancer. Test pilots walking up to it for the first time were known to stop, stare, and ask the ground crew the same incredulous question: "This thing actually flies?" Not only did it fly, it flew like nothing else. It was a high-altitude juggernaut, a weapon that didn't seek to outdance its opponents, but to bludgeon them into submission with overwhelming power and firepower. It was a perfect reflection of American industrial philosophy, brute force engineering backed by seemingly unlimited resources. It was big, it was heavy, it was thirsty, and it was complicated. It was, in every sense of the word, a monster. And it was exactly the monster the Allies would need to slay the dragons of the Luftwaffe.
Before the P-47 Thunderbolt could become a terror to the Germans, it first had to be mastered by its own pilots. And this trial by fire proved to be a brutal, unforgiving, and often lethal process. The first unit to be equipped with the new fighter was the 56th Fighter Group, commanded by the determined Major Hubert "Hub" Zemke. Training at Bridgeport, Connecticut, Zemke and his men, many of them eager young pilots fresh from flight school, initially despised the aircraft. The Jug, as they nicknamed it for its milk jug shape, was unlike anything they had ever flown. It was a beast on the ground, prone to violent ground loops on landing due to its narrow-track landing gear and massive torque. On takeoff, the same immense power from the R2800 engine could cause a catastrophic torque roll if not handled with precise and delicate rudder control. The learning curve was vertical, and the cost was appallingly high. Between September 1942 and January 1943, the 56th Fighter Group lost a staggering 18 pilots killed and 41 aircraft destroyed in training accidents alone. The Thunderbolt was killing more Americans in training than the entire Luftwaffe would in the aircraft's first few months of combat. Its most terrifying characteristic was discovered in a dive. The aircraft's heavy, streamlined design allowed it to accelerate with astonishing enthusiasm. Pilots pushing the aircraft in steep descents found themselves encountering a frightening new aerodynamic phenomenon: compressibility. As they approached the speed of sound, shockwaves would form over the thick wings and control surfaces, causing the controls to freeze solid, leaving the pilot a helpless passenger in a 7-ton plummeting projectile. Yet for the few who survived this punishing education and truly mastered the beast, they discovered something extraordinary. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, a farm boy from Lawton, Oklahoma, who would go on to become one of America's top aces, described his first flight with a sense of awe. He recalled, "It was like strapping yourself to a locomotive. The power was unbelievable. You didn't fly it, you aimed it." This was the essence of the Thunderbolt. It was not a fencer's foil, it was a battle axe. When the 4th and 56th Fighter Groups finally arrived in England and entered combat in the spring of 1943, their initial encounters seemed to confirm every German prejudice and every Allied fear. In the swirling, turning dogfights of the mid-altitudes, the P-47 was a disaster. He couldn't turn with the nimble Focke-Wulf 190s. He couldn't climb with the legendary Messerschmitt Bf 109s. Luftwaffe pilots, masters of energy fighting, quickly developed tactics to exploit these glaring weaknesses. They would attack the heavy Thunderbolts from below, initiating turning fights where the P-47's agility was no match for their own nimble interceptors. The reports from German commanders were filled with scorn. Hauptmann Josef Pips, Priller, the swaggering commander of Jagdgeschwader 26, filed a report after his first encounter that dripped with contempt. He wrote, "The new American fighter is meat for the slaughter. It flies like a truck, turns like a freight train, and climbs like a pregnant cow. Our boys are calling them Indianer, fat targets pretending to be warriors." The grim statistics backed up his assessment. In their first month of operations, American fighter groups lost 14 Thunderbolts for a meager 3 confirmed German kills. The experienced pilots of the Royal Air Force, observing from their Spitfire squadrons, quietly suggested the Americans might want to reconsider their choice of aircraft. British wit, ever sharp, produced a joke that circulated through the air bases. The best evasive maneuver in a P-47 was to unstrap from your seat and run around the roomy cockpit. The grand American experiment appeared to be a catastrophic failure. The dinosaur seemed destined for extinction.
Amid the disastrous early missions and the growing chorus of doubt, something strange was happening that German intelligence, in its confidence, failed to fully appreciate. The P-47s that were being shot down were absorbing an almost supernatural amount of punishment before they finally fell. One aircraft from the 4th Fighter Group returned to its base at Debden on May 4th, riddled with 21 cannon holes and over 100 machine gun strikes, damage that would have caused a Spitfire or a Messerschmitt to disintegrate in midair. The massive, air-cooled radial engine, lacking the vulnerable liquid coolant systems of its counterparts, could shrug off direct hits that would have seized an inline engine cold. The beast was clumsy, but it was incredibly tough. This hidden virtue, its sheer refusal to die, was about to be demonstrated in the most dramatic fashion imaginable, in an encounter that would become a legend on both sides of the war. The date was June 26, 1943. Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group's 61st Fighter Squadron was returning from an escort mission over France. His formation of 48 Thunderbolts was bounced by 16 Focke-Wulf 190s from the elite Jagdgeschwader 26, led by Hauptmann Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, the younger brother of Germany's famed general of fighters Adolf Galland. The German attack was a textbook example of tactical perfection, a dive out of the sun with a massive speed advantage. Johnson, flying at the vulnerable rear of the American formation, was caught in a deadly crossfire. The world exploded. In the first few seconds, his Thunderbolt was savaged by a hail of 20mm cannon shells. His canopy shattered, spraying him with plexiglass shards. Hot, oily hydraulic fluid gushed into the cockpit, blinding him. The engine cowling was ripped away, and a fire erupted behind the instrument panel. Wounded in the leg and nose by shrapnel, his training kicked in. Get out. He jettisoned the resaddered remains of his canopy, but as he prepared to bail out, he discovered he was trapped. A 20mm shell had exploded directly in the canopy track, welding it shut. He was entombed in a burning, plummeting wreck at 27,000 feet. What happened next defied all known principles of combat aviation. With no forward visibility through the oil-smeared windscreen, a violently shaking engine on the verge of quitting, and controls that only responded intermittently, Johnson somehow managed to wrestle the dying aircraft level and point its nose toward England. The P-47, a flying sieve of twisted metal and severed lines, simply refused to give up. But his ordeal was far from over. A lone Focke-Wulf 190, flown by an unknown German pilot, spotted the crippled Thunderbolt limping for home at less than 170 miles per hour. The German pilot, seeing an easy kill, positioned himself astern and opened fire with his full armament of cannons and machine guns. Unable to evade, Johnson could only hunch behind his armor plate and pray as his aircraft absorbed the punishment. The German pilot expended his entire cannon ammunition load into the P-47. Still, it flew. He repositioned and fired again, this time with only machine guns. Still, it flew. Utterly baffled, the German pilot pulled alongside Johnson's wreck. He could see his face clearly. Young, blonde, his expression morphing from confident aggression to utter confusion, and then to something approaching awe. The German circled, emptied his remaining machine gun rounds into the Thunderbolt, and pulled alongside one last time. He shook his head in disbelief, gave Johnson an informal salute, and peeled away completely out of ammunition. Against all odds, Robert Johnson nursed his shattered aircraft across the channel, landing at RAF Manston just as the engine finally seized on the runway. Ground crews stopped counting the bullet and shell holes after they reached 200. The aircraft's structural backbone was shot through, its controls shredded, yet it had brought its pilot home. The dinosaur had refused to go extinct.
The survival of Robert Johnson and his mangled P-47, serial number 416235, sent shockwaves through the command structures of both the Allied and Axis air forces. For the Americans, it was a profound revelation. Engineers from Republic Aviation and the 8th Air Force, who meticulously examined the wreckage, realized they had fundamentally underestimated their own creation. They had designed an aircraft to be rugged, but they had unwittingly built something with a damage tolerance that bordered on the indestructible. The incident became a crucial data point, confirming that the design philosophy of prioritizing mass, power, and durability over delicate agility had a brutal merit of its own. Morale, which had been flagging in the Thunderbolt squadrons, soared. Pilots now knew that the heavy, unforgiving beast they flew might not be a dancer, but it was a heavyweight prizefighter that could absorb a tremendous beating and still carry them home. On the German side, the reaction was one of stunned disbelief. When the initial combat reports from Jagdgeschwader 26 arrived at Luftwaffe intelligence, they were dismissed as fantasy. No fighter aircraft, according to their extensive combat experience, could possibly absorb that level of concentrated fire from a Focke-Wulf 19 and continue to fly. It was impossible. But the testimony of the pilot who had expended his entire ammunition load and the corroborating accounts from others in his squadron could not be ignored. The impossible had happened. The flying milk bottle was not made of glass, it was forged from iron. This single event forced a grudging, terrifying reassessment of the new American fighter. This newfound understanding of the P-47's true nature coincided with a tactical revolution led by the very commanders who had suffered through its painful introduction. Men like Colonel Hubert Zemke of the 56th Fighter Group, through brutal trial and error, began to decipher the Thunderbolt's unique language of combat. He issued new orders that turned conventional fighter doctrine on its head. Don't turn with them. Don't try to climb with them at low altitude. Use your weight. Use your power. Use your guns. Suddenly, the Thunderbolt's greatest perceived weakness, its immense mass, was transformed into its most potent weapon. In a dive, the 7-ton fighter was untouchable. From 30,000 feet, a P-47 could plummet toward the Earth at speeds exceeding 550 miles per hour, faster than any German piston-engine fighter could possibly achieve even in a vertical dive. This incredible velocity was kinetic energy, a stored weapon that could be unleashed in a devastating attack or converted back into altitude in a zoom climb that left pursuing German fighters stalled out and helpless below. Pilots like Captain Walker Bud Macurin, who would become one of the first American aces in the European theater, perfected this new method of fighting. It became known as the boom and zoom, though the pilots themselves gave it a more fitting name, the Thunderbolt turkey shoot. Traditional swirling dogfights were abandoned. Instead, the Thunderbolt formations would climb to the stratosphere, to altitudes of 30,000 feet or more, far higher than German fighters could comfortably or effectively operate. They would orbit like patient hawks, waiting for the Luftwaffe to appear below to challenge the bomber streams. When the enemy was spotted, the Thunderbolts would roll inverted and dive. They came down like falling anvils, making deflection shooting for the defending Germans a near impossibility. At the bottom of the dive, as they flashed through the enemy formation, the American heavy machine guns would speak. The rules of aerial combat over Europe were being systematically and violently rewritten. The era of the graceful duelist was ending. The era of the high-speed executioner had begun.
The full terrifying potential of the Thunderbolt's firepower, married to its new dive and zoom tactics, was unleashed upon an unsuspecting Luftwaffe on August 17, 1943. This was the date of the infamous Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission, one of the most ambitious and costly daylight bombing raids attempted by the American 8th Air Force to that point. The mission was a deep penetration strike aimed at crippling Germany's ball-bearing industry. While it would become a black day for the B-17 Flying Fortress crews who suffered catastrophic losses beyond the range of their fighter escort, it would also be the day the P-47 truly announced its arrival as a killing machine. As the vast bomber formations crossed into German airspace, the Luftwaffe responded in force. Among the defenders were the specialized Zerstörer, or destroyer groups, equipped with the heavily armed, twin-engined Messerschmitt Bf-110. These were dedicated bomber killers, slower and less maneuverable than single-engine fighters, but bristling with heavy cannons and air-to-air rockets designed to tear the unescorted bombers apart. A formation of these destroyers moved to position themselves for an attack run on the vulnerable B-17s. What they didn't see were the hunters lurking high above. Major David Schilling, leading the 62nd Fighter Squadron of the 56th Fighter Group, spotted the German heavy fighters from 28,000 feet. He gave the order, and his flight of 4 Thunderbolts rolled over and plunged into their attack dive. Unteroffizier Roth, a gunner in one of the Bf-110s, survived the ensuing massacre. In a post-capture interrogation, his words still carried the shock of the event. The American fighters came down like hammers from heaven. He said, "I saw them strike the fighter's wing. The P-47 didn't even wobble. Then he fired. The aircraft ahead of us simply came apart. Not shot down, destroyed. Wings severed from the fuselage, tail severed. The crew compartment shredded into metal confetti. In 2 seconds, a 110 became nothing." In an engagement that lasted less than 60 seconds, Schilling's flight annihilated 8 of the specialized bomber killers. The German pilots had never experienced anything like it. The Thunderbolt's weapons battery was more than just 8 machine guns. It was a scientifically designed system of destruction. Each P-47 carried a staggering 3,400 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition,
weighing almost 900 pounds in total. The guns were harmonized to converge at a specific point in space, typically set at 300 yards in front of the aircraft. At this convergence point, the ballistic paths of all 8 guns intersected in a zone of destruction roughly 6 feet in diameter. Anything entering that zone was subjected to a barrage of 100 half-inch, 2,900 foot-per-second projectiles every single second. This was a revelation born of American industrial might. While German fighters were armed with powerful cannons, they were severely limited by ammunition capacity, often carrying only 120 to 200 rounds per gun. An American pilot, by contrast, could hold down his trigger for over 30 seconds of continuous fire, an eternity in a high-speed aerial engagement. The standard ammunition load was a carefully mixed belt of armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds, designed not just to punch holes, but to shred systems and ignite fuel tanks. Lieutenant Colonel Francis "Gabby" Gabreski, who would finish the war as America's top ace in Europe, described the effect with chilling simplicity. When you hit them with all 8, they don't just go down, they explode. I saw a 109 literally cut in half, the tail falling one way, the nose and wings another. The hammer of heaven had fallen, and it was pulverizing the Luftwaffe one aircraft at a time.
As the autumn of 1943 painted Europe in hues of brown and gray, the Luftwaffe was discovering another horrifying dimension to the P-47 Thunderbolt's capabilities. The very arena where they had once been undisputed masters, the frigid, oxygen-starved stratosphere, was being conquered by the American behemoth. The secret was not in the airframe, but in its heart. While German fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 relied on excellent but limited single-stage or two-stage mechanical superchargers, the P-47 possessed a complex turbo supercharger system designed by General Electric. This device gave the Thunderbolt an almost unfair advantage. As both German and American fighters climbed higher, the performance of the German engines began to degrade significantly above 25,000 feet. The air simply became too thin for their superchargers to compress effectively. The P-47's turbo, however, fed by hot exhaust gases, thrived in the thin air, allowing its mighty double-wasp engine to maintain its full 2,000 horsepower rating all the way up to 30,000 feet. This critical performance gap would have fatal consequences for one of Germany's greatest aces. The date was October 8, 1943. Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, a Ritterkreuz holder with an astounding 206 aerial victories, was leading his unit, Jagdgeschwader 1, against a B-17 formation over Bremen. At 28,000 feet, Philipp found his Focke-Wulf 190A6 feeling sluggish and unresponsive. Its powerful BMW 801 radial engine, a superb performer at medium altitudes, was now gasping for oxygen nearly 6 miles above the Earth. He and his men were vulnerable, their aircraft robbed of the speed and agility that gave them their edge. Suddenly, from high above, the hunters appeared. P-47s of the 56th Fighter Group, Hub Zemke's Wolfpack, dove on Philipp's formation from an altitude of 32,000 feet, where they were still operating at peak efficiency. The German fighters were, in the grim parlance of the American pilots, sitting ducks. Flying at 31,000 feet was Robert S. Johnson, the same pilot who had survived his incredible ordeal in June, now a seasoned combat veteran, well on his way to becoming an ace. He spotted Philipp's Focke-Wulf 190, identifiable by its elaborate personal nose art, and rolled into his attack. Johnson's after-action combat report was a model of detached, clinical lethality. Enemy aircraft exploded, no parachute observed. The death of Hans Philipp, a man who had survived over 500 combat missions on both the Eastern and Western fronts, sent a tremor of fear through the entire Luftwaffe. If one of their best, a master of aerial combat, could be so easily swatted from the sky by the fat American fighters, what chance did a novice pilot have? The German High Command, now deeply alarmed, ordered an immediate and thorough investigation into the P-47's true capabilities. The report, delivered to a furious Reich Marshal Hermann Göring in November 1943, was a litany of sobering and unwelcome truths.
The Thunderbolt's service ceiling was found to be over 42,000 feet, an altitude no German piston engine fighter could hope to reach. Its maximum dive speed approached the sound barrier, making it impossible to catch once it had the advantage. Its armor protection was extensive, a 3/8-inch steel plate behind the pilot, a half-inch bulletproof windscreen, and armored plates around the engine oil coolers. But the most disturbing conclusion, echoing the lesson from Robert Johnson's survival, was its almost mythical ruggedness. The report concluded that the P-47 could absorb the level of damage that would destroy 3 conventional fighters and still have a chance of returning home. The flying milk bottle had revealed itself to be an armored fortress that ruled the stratosphere.
Just as the Luftwaffe was coming to grips with the P-47's high-altitude performance and incredible durability, the American industrial machine delivered another devastating blow. In January of 1944, a new variant of the Thunderbolt began arriving at air bases across England, the P-47D-22. This model was equipped with a seemingly minor upgrade that would completely transform the aircraft's performance and its psychological impact on the enemy: a new Hamilton Standard hydromatic propeller. This wasn't just any propeller. It was a colossal paddle-bladed screw, 13 feet in diameter, with enormous broad-chord blades that bit into the air like massive oars, converting the engine's raw power into thrust with brutal efficiency. The improvement was immediate and dramatic. Where earlier Thunderbolts had struggled with a sluggish climb rate, the new paddle blade variants could claw their way skyward at over 3,000 feet per minute, a rate that now matched or even exceeded their German adversaries at most altitudes. The pregnant cow had learned to leap. This new propeller also dramatically improved acceleration, allowing pilots to build up energy faster and making the P-47 a much more formidable opponent in any engagement that wasn't a tight, low-speed turning fight. Hauptmann Heinz Knoke, a veteran of Jagdgeschwader 11 with over 200 missions to his name, encountered these new variants during a bomber interception near Hanover in February 1944. The experience left him deeply shaken. He wrote in his combat diary, "The fat American fighters have learned to climb. We bounced to formation near Hanover, expecting our usual advantage. They turned into us and climbed with us. When we tried to disengage by climbing away, they followed us up to 30,000 feet. Schmidt was caught and blown apart, nothing left but smoke and fragments. These are not the same machines we laughed at last year." Beyond the raw performance, the paddle blade propeller gave the Thunderbolt a new terrifying voice. The tips of the massive blades reached supersonic speeds in a dive, and even at high power settings, creating a distinctive, deep, thundering roar that could be heard from miles. German ground troops soon learned to identify the sound of approaching P-47s by this noise alone, a deep, threatening rumble that signaled imminent death from above. They gave it a new name, Donnerschlag, the thunderclap. This performance boost was paired with another critical upgrade, the ability to carry external fuel tanks. Fitted with 2 108-gallon wing tanks, the Thunderbolt's combat range was extended to over 1,000 miles, finally allowing it to escort the heavy bombers all the way to targets deep inside Germany and back. The Luftwaffe's strategy of waiting for the short-legged Allied fighters to turn for home before attacking the bombers was now obsolete. The Thunderbolts could stay and fight. German pilots who once sought out the P-47 now developed a grudging respect that bordered on dread. Major Gunther Rall, one of Germany's top 3 aces with 275 victories, mostly on the Eastern Front, recalled a harrowing encounter on March 6, 1944. He wrote, "We saw them above us, fat silhouettes against the sun. Someone laughed and said, 'Here come the flying pigs.' Nobody was laughing 30 seconds later. They came down like an avalanche, faster than we could react. Their guns didn't fire in bursts like ours. They poured out solid streams of fire. Getting caught in that stream meant instant death. The thunderclap was now the sound of the Reich's doom."
As the spring of 1944 saw the arrival of the superlative long-range P-51 Mustang, which began to take over the primary high-altitude escort role, the P-47 Thunderbolt was unleashed in a new capacity, one that would make it arguably the most feared single aircraft in the entire German military arsenal. With its massive airframe, powerful engine, and unparalleled ruggedness, the P-47 was perfectly suited for the brutal, low-level world of ground attack. The transition began in earnest in April 1944 as the Allies gathered their strength for the inevitable invasion of France. German soldiers would soon come to know and despise the Thunderbolt, not as a fighter, but as a Jabo, the German contraction for Jagdbomber, or fighter bomber. The Thunderbolt's existing battery of 8 heavy machine guns proved just as devastating against ground targets as it was against aircraft. The standard armor-piercing incendiary rounds could easily penetrate the thin top armor of German half-tracks, trucks, and even tanks like the Panzer IV. A single 2-second burst could pour over 160 half-inch projectiles into an area the size of a supply truck, shredding it into a flaming wreck in an instant. But it was the addition of external ordnance that transformed the P-47 from a fighter into a true multi-role monster, a flying artillery piece. The P-47 D-25 variant could haul an astonishing bomb load, 2 1,000-pound bombs on its wing pylons and a 500-pounder on its belly rack, a payload equivalent to that of early war light bombers like the Bristol Blenheim. Later, these were supplemented with 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, or HVARs, each delivering the destructive power of a 105mm artillery shell with pinpoint accuracy. For the German soldier on the ground, the experience was hell on earth. Oberst Hans von Luck, commander of the 125th Panzergrenadier Regiment during the Normandy campaign, witnessed the Thunderbolt's fury firsthand. He wrote they came in low, so low you could see the pilots' faces. The sound was terrifying. Engines roaring, rockets screaming, then the hammer of those heavy machine guns. A column of our trucks simply ceased to exist. 20 vehicles transformed into burning wreckage in an instant. The psychological effect on the men was devastating. They were flying artillery with the accuracy of snipers. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe discovered just how completely the balance of air power had shifted. Over 500 P-47s flew missions over the beaches, forming an impenetrable steel umbrella over the Allied landings. The few German fighters that attempted to intervene were simply massacred. Oberleutnant Wolfgang Fischer, one of only a handful of German pilots to even reach the invasion area that day, reported back that the sky simply belonged to the Americans. Thunderbolts were stacked from sea level to 30,000 feet, he said. We tried to break through at dawn, 12 fighters from our group. I was the only one to return. You couldn't climb over them, you couldn't dive under them. Their guns turned our fighters into aluminum rain. In the weeks following the invasion, as the battle for Normandy raged, P-47 squadrons of the 9th Air Force systematically destroyed the Wehrmacht's ability to move and resupply during daylight hours. The statistics were staggering. In the month of June alone, 9th Air Force Thunderbolts claimed the destruction of over 3,800 trucks, 500 tanks and armored vehicles, and nearly 650 locomotives. The German army was paralyzed, forced to conduct all major movements under the cover of darkness, crippling its ability to counter advances. On the ground, German troops began to suffer from a new affliction, a condition their medical officers termed Jabo fever, acute anxiety, tremors, and physical stress symptoms that appeared whenever the distinctive roar of the Thunderbolt's engine was heard. The flying milk bottle had become the boogeyman of the battlefield.
While the P-47 was carving a path of destruction across the skies and battlefields of Europe, its unique combination of firepower, range, and extreme ruggedness was proving equally valuable half a world away in the brutal and unforgiving environment of the Pacific Theater. The vast distances and harsh, primitive operating conditions of the war against Japan demanded an aircraft that could fly long missions, absorb punishment, and bring its pilot home from over hundreds of miles of open ocean or impenetrable jungle. The Thunderbolt, initially thought to be a poor fit for the agile turning fights favored by Japanese pilots, turned out to be the perfect tool for the job.
The 348th Fighter Group, operating from crude airstrips in New Guinea under the command of the aggressive and innovative Colonel Neil Kirby, pioneered tactics that leveraged the P-47's strengths against the nimble but fragile Japanese fighters like the Mitsubishi A6M-0. Using the same high-speed boom and zoom tactics being perfected in Europe, Kirby and his pilots would use the Thunderbolt's superior high-altitude performance and diving speed to strike with devastating effect. On October 11, 1943, Kirby himself demonstrated the Thunderbolt's lethal potential, leading a flight of just 4 P-47s against a formation of 40 Japanese aircraft over Wewak. In a single furious engagement, he personally shot down 6 enemy planes, an action for which he was awarded the Medal of Honor. Japanese pilots, accustomed to fighting American planes like the P-40 Warhawk and F-4F Wildcat, were completely unprepared for the Thunderbolt. Japan's legendary ace, Saburo Sakai, encountered P-47s over New Guinea, and his writings reflect a sense of shock. He wrote after the war, "We called them monsters. Our 20mm cannon, which could destroy a P-40 with a few hits, seemed to have no effect. I put dozens of rounds into a Thunderbolt and watched it fly away trailing smoke. Their return fire was terrifying, streams of heavy bullets that tore our aircraft apart." To specifically address the extreme range requirements of the Pacific, Republic developed the P-47N, a dedicated long-range variant with larger wings containing integrated fuel tanks, extending its range to an incredible 2,350 miles. It was these P-47Ns that would eventually escort B-29 superfortresses on their grueling raids to the Japanese home islands. Back in Europe, as the war entered its final technologically charged phase, Thunderbolt pilots faced their most advanced adversary yet, the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. With a top speed of over 540 miles per hour, the German jet should have been untouchable. In a straight and level race, it was, but the resourceful P-47 pilots quickly identified the jet's vulnerabilities. They were sluggish during their long takeoff runs and vulnerable when landing, making them prime targets for strafing attacks on their airfields. More importantly, P-47 pilots discovered that by using their phenomenal diving speed, they could sometimes catch the jets. On November 27, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group achieved one of the first P-47 victories over an Me-262. Diving his Thunderbolt from 28,000 feet, Meyer pushed his aircraft to its absolute limits, reaching speeds near 500 miles per hour, just fast enough to close the distance on a jet flying at a lower altitude. The German pilot, confident in his technological superiority, never saw the diving P-47 until Meyer's 8.5 calibers opened up from 400 yards. Meyer's combat report was stark. The enemy aircraft disintegrated under fire. Large pieces, including both engines, separated from the fuselage.
On New Year's Day, 1945, the Luftwaffe made its last desperate gamble. In an operation codenamed Bodenplatte, nearly 900 German fighters were hurled against Allied airfields across Belgium, France, and the Netherlands in a surprise dawn attack. It was a daring stroke, meant to cripple Allied air power on the ground and regain control of the skies during the critical Battle of the Bulge. At Airfield Y-34, near Metz, France, home to the 365th Fighter Group's P-47s, the assault achieved temporary success. German Bf-109s and FW-190s swept in at treetop level, strafing and bombing through the snow-choked morning, destroying 22 Thunderbolts on the ground amid chaos and fire. Later that day, a captured German pilot, confident and arrogant in his victory, was brought before the group's commander, Major George Brooking. Pointing toward the smoking wrecks, the German sneered, "What do you think of that?" Brooking's reply would become legend throughout the 9th Air Force. He looked calmly toward the runway, where ground crews were already clearing the debris to make room for replacements. "By tomorrow, we'll have 40 new ones. How long will it take you to replace your pilots?" The German smirk vanished. It wasn't a boast. Within 48 hours, factory-fresh P-47 D-40S were flown in from replacement depots in England, lined up, armed, and ready for combat. Operation Bodenplatte had turned into a disaster for the Luftwaffe. They lost 271 aircraft,
and far more devastatingly, over 200 of their most experienced pilots. The Allies lost 130 planes on the ground, but every one was replaced within a week. This was the brutal arithmetic of industrial warfare. The Germans could win battles. The Americans were winning the war on the assembly line. Republic Aviation alone produced 15,683 P-47 Thunderbolts, more than any other American fighter of the war. At its peak, the Farmingdale plant completed one new Thunderbolt every hour, 24 hours a day. A second plant, built on farmland in Evansville, Indiana, was turning out 500 aircraft per month by 1944. Each machine was a marvel of manufacturing: 65,000 parts, 8 miles of wiring, and enough firepower to erase a city block. By mid-1944, Thunderbolt squadrons were expending over 10 million rounds of .50 caliber ammunition every month, and even more impressive than the machines were the men who flew them. By 1944, the United States was graduating 30,000 fully trained pilots each year, more than Germany produced during the entire war. While a novice German pilot went to the front with barely 100 hours of flight time, his American counterpart arrived with 400, trained in formation flying, gunnery, navigation, and survival, often in the same aircraft he would take into combat. It wasn't a fair fight. Even Joseph Pips Priller, the ace who had once mocked the Thunderbolt, admitted bitterly, "They have fuel for training, ammunition for practice, spare parts for everything. We have nothing but courage, and courage without resources is just delayed defeat. We laughed at them in 1943. We're not laughing now." In the end, the Luftwaffe wasn't buried by a better fighter, but by a better system, an unstoppable avalanche of steel, fuel, and men.
By the spring of 1945, the once mighty Luftwaffe had been systematically annihilated. It existed now only as a phantom force on paper. Its airfields lay in ruins, its fuel tanks were dry, and its veteran pilots were gone, killed, captured, or broken. Those few who remained faced impossible odds. To take to the sky was to enter a world that no longer belonged to them, a world patrolled by swarms of P-47 Thunderbolts, dominating every altitude from the treetops to the stratosphere. Feldwebel Klaus Brettschneider, one of the last pilots trained in the dying days of the Reich, flew a single mission over Leipzig. His encounter with the Thunderbolts lasted 12 seconds. He said, "I saw them diving from above, 4 Thunderbolts in perfect formation. I tried to turn, but they were too fast. My aircraft shook like it was hit by sledgehammers. The engine exploded, the wing tore away. In my parachute, I watched them destroy my entire staffel. 6 fighters gone in under a minute." The psychological impact was absolute. The laughter of 1943 had become pure terror. The sound of the Donnerschlag, the Thunderbolt's roaring guns, sent even battle-hardened soldiers scrambling for cover. When the war ended, the numbers told the rest of the story. In the European theater alone, P-47s destroyed over 7,000 German aircraft, both in the air and on the ground. They obliterated 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 tanks and armored vehicles, and nearly 70,000 trucks. All of this with a 4.6-to-1 kill ratio in aerial combat, while suffering the lowest loss rate of any major Allied fighter bomber. The transformation was complete. The Thunderbolt had gone from an object of ridicule to an instrument of annihilation. A captured German intelligence file on the P-47 told the story with chilling precision. April 1943, large, unmaneuverable, minimal threat. December 1943, significant threat, above 25,000 feet. June 1944, critical threat, at all altitudes. March 1945, best fighter bomber of the war. Unsurvivable in direct engagement. Years later, at a reunion of former adversaries, General Adolf Galland, head of Germany's fighter arm, reflected on that evolution. "We made a terrible mistake," Galland admitted. "We saw this big, heavy fighter and laughed. We didn't understand. The Americans weren't building a European fighter. They were building an American one, designed around production, firepower, and survivability. They knew that in a war of attrition, the plane that could take punishment and deliver it back would win. And they were right."
The P-47 Thunderbolt was the heaviest single-engine piston fighter ever mass-produced. A brute, born of industry, not elegance. It was flown by young men, maintained by hurriedly trained mechanics, and kept alive by a supply chain that stretched across an ocean. It entered the war as a joke. It ended it as a legend. In the United States Air Force Museum, a single quote from a captured German pilot serves as its epitaph. He said, "We laughed when we first saw them. We stopped laughing when we realized they didn't need to turn or climb. They just pointed those guns at you and you ceased to exist." The laughter died with our comrades.